Thank you, Professor Kéchichian, for taking us through this, the Armenian genocide and how the nation has survived. I think everyone would agree that we have been today enriched with your presentation on understanding the Armenian genocide, the issues surrounding it, its history, and also for ending your presentation on this very hopeful note about the survival of the nation, despite all efforts the by the Turkish Empire at that time. Uh, I'm sure there would be several questions from the audience. I would request them to write their question in the chat box, and then we will request everyone to ask their questions, if they can come on the audio and video. I just wanted to ask one question before we go to the audience. There is a very general lack of awareness about the Armenian genocide. And there is a reluctance among several countries all over the world, but also more specifically in the West and even in the United States, to recognize this as a genocide and as a lesson for the world. Why is it so? I mean, why is it that there is such a reluctance, despite people knowing fully well that this happened, and this has been the contribution which, as you had said, and we know even in the Indian context, if one goes back, there still small communities, as you were mentioning in the beginning also. So why is it there such a reluctance to recognize this?
Well, that's a very good question. But remember that this is a very ancient nation we're talking about. This is a nation, people are tired of old nations. But more recently, during the past 100 years, the reason why the genocide itself has not really been discussed very openly has to do with the Cold War. At the height of the Cold War, Turkey, which was a member of NATO after all, presented itself as a bulwark of the West against the Soviet Union. Now, of course, things have changed now. Now, even though Turkey is still within NATO, it is allied with Russia against America and Europe, which is really the irony of all ironies. I suppose that in the next couple of weeks, when NATO meets in June in Brussels, Mr. Erdogan and President Biden will work this out. But it seems to me that the reason why people are not talking about the Armenian genocide or have not spoken about it during all this time had to do with the Cold War itself, that somehow we did not want to upset our Turkish friends. The Turks today are not responsible for the genocide itself. I mean, they were not the ones who committed the genocide. It was their forefathers who did it. The Ottomans had did it. You notice I used the word Ottoman. I did not use the word Turk. They wanted to Turkify, but obviously within the Ottoman setting. Now, if they deny, the Germans who committed the Holocaust were big enough to acknowledge the fact that they murdered 6 million Jews. And this is the difference between a German and a Turk, where you have a certain maturity that acknowledges historical facts. It's like, for example, a Brit today denying what they did in India, murdering hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, there are not too many Brits today who will have the audacity to say, when we went for a picnic in India. Same here. I think this denial on the part is really undeep. If today President Biden formally acknowledges that the United States government recognizes the Armenian genocide, things will change in the future, and this subject will no longer be taboo. And besides, the Cold War is over, even though President Putin would like to bring it back for his own personal reasons, but I don't think that he will find a partner to tango with in a new Cold War. I think that you will find that we will talk about the Armenian genocide more openly. Scholars have already made their contribution. There have been hundreds of books written on the subject, and there's plenty there for people to see. So I think that's the reason, the Cold War.
Thank you, Professor. May I now request Ambassador Sanjay Singh, sir, if you have any question or comments.
Thank you, Professor Kéchichian, for your account, a very poignant account of a tragedy of history, the tragedy which befell the Armenian people. I first saw the pictures of this, which tell a tale, when I visited the museum in Isfahan in Iran, which is dedicated to, there's an Armenian quarter in Isfahan, and it is dedicated, and there's a museum there dedicated to the Armenian Genocide. Mm-hmm. And that is when I looked at the curious relationship between Armenia and Armenian community and Iran-Turkish relations. This is a very fascinating thing, and I'll ask you about that later. But yes, I visited Yerevan sometime in 2012, and I had the opportunity to look at Mount Ararat and the very famous nectar called Ararat brandy. And when I visited there, and as you said, India and Armenia have had a very long history. It is said that in 149 BC, two Indian princes, Ganesh and Krishna, established small kingdoms in what is present-day Armenia.
Wow.
And one of Akbar's, let us say, Akbar's wives was Maryam Zamarin Begum. She was from Armenia. The first Armenian to land in India, technically, was in 780 AD, called a gentleman called Thomas Canna. And you were talking about the Armenian businessman in Hong Kong. His name was Sir Catchwick Paul Charter, 1846 to 1826.
Absolutely.
The first Indian classical record of an Indian classical musician was Gohar Jan in 1902, which was, she was of Armenian descent. And the first Armenian newspaper, which was published from Chennai, as Professor said, was Azdarar, 1794. The first Armenian church was in Agra, 1562. And then Church of Nazareth was in Calcutta in 1707. So we have a very long and very interesting connection with Armenia. I just wanted to point that out. And we have very good relations presently with the Republic of Armenia. Having said that, you know, it is a very great curiosity for me always to find, whenever I look at that region, is that close understanding between Russia and Armenia on one hand, the close understanding between Armenia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the differences between Armenia and Turkey, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the close relationship between Azerbaijan and Turkey. This is something I'd like you to share with this audience. Is it because of the Armenian question that this has happened? And the relationship between, as you notice, you know, the Armenian exodus, which went down beyond Mosul, it did enter into Iran, and they did get from Diyarbakir, they went down to Iran and they settled in Western Iran also. So Turkey, Armenia, and Russia.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. You always ask very pertinent questions, and you challenge not just me, but all the other speakers in this series. Indian-Armenian relations are very close, and it explains to a certain extent my love to you as well. So we're continuing the relationship between Armenians and Indians, and I am perfect example of that. I adore my Indian friends, and I have been to India 3 times, and hopefully I will come back. Now in Isfahan, you said you visited. Isfahan was a very important city where Shah Abbas brought thousands of Armenian skilled painters and builders, and all of the palaces that were built throughout Iran during the Qajar dynasty were built by Armenian skilled builders. And the relationship, and they've settled in Isfahan. Isfahan is the most important country in terms of the Armenian presence in Iran. And the relationship has been very, very long. And during the Holocaust and during the genocide, a lot of Armenians also came and settled in Iran as well, from Diyarbakir and elsewhere. That's the reason why, for example, today you have a very large Armenian community from Iranian descent. Most of these folks have left now. They are in the United States, but there are still some left. Now, to answer specifically your question about all these geopolitical changes between Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan. Now, you know, Armenia is in a very difficult geopolitical position. It has essentially, as a republic, I'm not talking about now about the Armenian nation, I'm talking about the Republic of Armenia. That's something totally different, because the Armenian nation is all over the world, as I have presented in the slides. About 10 million Armenians around the world now, of whom less than 3 million are inside the Republic of Armenia. So the majority are in the diaspora. So I'm talking about the geopolitical position of the Republic of Armenia. It has 2 fundamental allies in the world today, that is Iran and Russia. And both of these countries support Armenia for their own very different reasons. The Iranians support Armenia over Azerbaijan because they're afraid of a secessionist movement inside Iran itself, since there is such a large Azeri population inside Iran. And the idea might cross the mind of Azeri leaders inside Iran that one day they would want to be independent, which means the secession movement could ally itself with the Azerbaijani government and create an entirely new republic, a little bit like the Kurd model as well. Russia has its own interest because it considers the Caucasus region to be the soft underbelly of the old Soviet Union and Russia, and it wants to make sure that its presence there is very strong. Turkey's position is slightly different, however. Turkey has been, since World War II, essentially, a Western ally. It has always been pro-Western. And the Turkish population is divided into 2 parts. There are the Oriental Turks and there are the Westernized Turks. And Turkey is a dynamic society, 85 million people and counting. It has global interests, regional and global interests. It perceives itself as being an important country. If you were to ask a Turk, for example, what is the role of Turkey in the region, the Turk will essentially argue with you that it is far more important than anything that Iran or any other power in the region has. It considers itself to be a regional power par excellence, and therefore its relationship with Azerbaijan is purely geopolitical. Of course, there are Turkic peoples, and they share a great deal because the Turks are Tatars, and they came from Central Asia, as I said, about 1,200, 1,300 years ago, which means they are next to the Anatolian plateau. Armenians have been there for 6,000 years. So therefore, the geopolitical situation is entirely different. However, now we have seen that President Erdogan has essentially changed his positions, and he is no longer pro-Western. He is no longer perceived in the West as being part of the alliance, even though it's still a member of NATO. Time will tell whether or not the NATO allies will eventually kick Turkey out of NATO. We will see what will happen. I will not be surprised if it were to occur. And the best evidence for this is the fact that Erdogan is now purchasing the S-400 anti-ballistic missile system, and at the same time, you know, it wants to buy the F-35, which the United States, even under the Trump administration, has stopped. So therefore, you have a lot of geopolitical issues that are surrounding the Republic of Armenia that is caught in the middle of this power game. And it is small, it is relatively weak, it has very few friends, mostly Iran and Russia, and it is
Thank you, Professor, for the very detailed, answer on what Ambassador Singh was talking about. And thank you, Sir Sanjay Singh, sir, for for that very provocative and very eloquent, actually, exposition on India-Armenia relations and the issue at large. May I now request Dasun Wonglang, who is a student and working on the memory issue, politics of memory, and and the question of Armenian genocide. Jason, can you come, and ask your question yourself? And I'd also request you to introduce yourself so that we have an idea about your work also.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Professor, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Walang. I'm a PhD scholar in the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies, JNU. My thesis is on the politics of memory and the Armenian genocide, where I focus on the two aspects of the memory and how it shapes the domestic aspects of the Armenian nation, as well as the foreign policy, as recognition plays a very big role when it comes to the foreign policy of the Armenian nation. And so, very wonderful talk, Professor. I have three questions actually. My first question is, I think half of it has been answered by you in the previous question itself. As you know that Joe Biden, as per news report, is planning to recognize the genocide today itself as the Armenian genocide, but why is this sudden change of stance in the American leadership, which has promised a lot, including Obama in 2008, stating in his campaign that he would recognize the genocide, but did not? Why is it sudden stance, and will the American leadership live to its promise? And my second question is on the recent Artsakh war or Nagorno-Karabakh war. Do the Armenian society or the nation believe that this is an extension of the Armenian genocide, which the Azeris, as they are also considered Turks in their nature, Turk in nature, so is it an extension of that? And my third question is related to Israel. Israel has a Jewish population. Armenians have gone through a genocide, the Jews have gone through the Holocaust. But what is stopping Israel from recognizing the Armenian genocide for so long? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for these questions, also very provocative. Now, on the first one, I'm hoping that President Biden will also take the first step and recognize the Armenian genocide today. We're all waiting anxiously to find out what his decision will be. Hopefully, as the State Department yesterday announced that they were going to formally recognize that. Now, last year, the Senate and the Congress of the United States already took the initiative by over 400 votes to actually recognize the Armenian genocide. But it's something else when the President of the United States comes out and says that in fact it was a genocide. The Turks will be very upset by this step, but so what? I mean, people have to grow up, I suppose. So we'll wait and see what Joe Biden does. Now, with respect to the war that occurred in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, remember, the war was not with Armenia. It was between the Republic of Azerbaijan and the semi-autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the Russian name for Artsakh. Artsakh is the Armenian name. This is an area that it's predominantly Armenian. Most of its population is Armenian, has been Armenian for thousands of years. But Joe Stalin, in his creation of the Homo Sovieticus, decided that he would go ahead and take this autonomous region from Armenia and put it inside Azerbaijan. And this is the creation, the Soviet Union's creation of the ideal Homo Sovieticus, the ideal man, whereby there will be no ethnicities, no religious differences, and so on and so forth. But Artsakh has been predominantly Armenian for millennia. And the best proof of this, of course, are all the churches that the Azeris are destroying. As far as I know, the Azeris don't build churches since they are Shia Muslims. And where did these churches come from? And there are thousands of them. Who built them? Who was there? And why destroy them? Why destroy this humanity, if you would like? Now, of course, the war, the Republic of Armenia helped Artsakh militarily and sent soldiers and everything. And about 5,000 Armenian soldiers were killed during the past conflict that lasted about a year. This is not the first time that the two sides are fighting, and they've been fighting every 30 years. And the Organization of Security and Cooperation is trying to mediate between all these folks to find some kind of a solution, but apparently they cannot find a solution, which is really a tragedy. My view is that the conflict over Artsakh is not finished. This is another step in the long-term conflict between these two populations. And the irony, of course, you notice that during the recent war, the Iranians have kept their mouth shut. And even though they provided military assistance to the Republic of Armenia and through them indirectly to the population of Artsakh. We will have to wait and see what the direction will be. Now, your final point about Israel not recognizing, we were talking about this, obviously. I have mentioned this a number of times every time we had speakers, Jewish speakers that have come on this program and gave presentations about the Holocaust. And I've always pleaded with them to actually go ahead and put as much influence as possible on the governments of Israel to actually go ahead and take this final step. This will sound very strange, but Colin Schindler, for example, was telling us that the Holocaust was unique and they wanted to maintain the uniqueness of the Holocaust. As far as I'm concerned, the murder of one single human being is a murder, whether he happens to be Jewish, he happens to be Christian, a Buddhist, a non-believer, it doesn't really matter, a Muslim, it doesn't really matter. But this is up for the Israelis to rise up to the occasion and be grown-ups about it and finally acknowledge the Holocaust. Remember what Hitler used to say when he was committing the Holocaust in Europe in 1943, 1942, 1943, his very famous line, allegedly, I don't know whether this is true, who remembers the Armenians? Whether Hitler said this or not, I don't know. But apparently, some people have said that this is accurate. Some people have said this is not accurate. So the Israelis have got to own up to this eventually.
Thank you, Professor. May I now request Sir to comment?
Thanks, Muddassir. You know, it's a very delightful exposition of a painful chapter in history. And my question is that to some extent, the world did not know much about Armenian, partly because not much was known available to people immediately, but largely because Armenia was part of Soviet Union. So therefore, Soviet Union had their own larger interest both before and after the Second World War to present its own narrative. So the world began to see Armenia as a distinct feature only after Armenia became an independent nation state. My question is, are the Armenian state doing enough to make the world know about the genocide? I think even almost 20 plus 30 years after the independence, if the international community does not know much about Armenian genocide, I think probably part of the blame had to be at the manner in which Armenian Republic has been managed. Because if you look at it, France, for instance, is calling genocide for quite some time. And there were individual Israelis who were talking about genocide from the 1990s. Some of the left of the Labour Party leaders are openly saying it has time for Israel. I'm talking about 94, 95. So there's a time has come for us to recognize the Armenian genocide. So when there were sufficient voices, but do you think that the Armenian state has not done sufficiently to propagate the idea to the world? They were always probably don't want to antagonize Turkey. Okay, let's reconcile and things, rather than taking a leading role in making the world know about it. Thank you very much.
Your answer to your question is absolutely correct. The Armenian governments have not done enough, but remember one of the slides that up April 24th, 19th, and they were really wiped out. The Armenian nation for the past 100 years or so not only has been dispersed all around the world, but its intellectuals have vanished, essentially vanished. I'm not talking about the scientists, I'm talking about the thinkers, about the social thinkers, the writers, the politically aware diplomats. All of these individuals were destroyed, including 2 deputies of the Ottoman Empire Parliament. So therefore, the Armenian intellectuals were nowhere to actually defend themselves. It took a while for a new generation of thinkers to come up. And within the Soviet Union, the Armenian government was not free to do what it wanted to do, because the Soviets decided policy. Moscow decided what kind of policy Yerevan would follow. It could not do what it wanted to do to explain to the world the Armenian genocide. The genocide's importance really in Armenia started on the 50th anniversary, and again, for political reasons, when there was Khrushchev, who was a revolutionary of his own right, who wanted to kind of stir the pot a little bit, and he created this monument inside Yerevan and awakened a lot of people inside. But in the West, this is where the movement started. You had university professors who came up in the 1950s and 1960s, who started to do research. These were the children of the Holocaust survivors, of the genocide survivors. These were the individuals who started reading and writing and speaking and giving lectures and so on and so forth. The Society for Armenian Studies was not created until 1973, 1974, just to give you an idea. So there has been a painful period of time where the intellectual life had to be recreated and reborn, because the Turks managed to destroy the intellect, but they could not destroy the nation, and they could not destroy the seeds of the Armenian intellects. And eventually, not just the scientists, as I have listed some of them in my presentation, but also famous writers like Kevorkian, like Hovhannisyan, and others at famous universities, at UCLA, and University in New York, at Columbia University and elsewhere, started to write these books about the Armenian genocide. And it took a while. And remember, now there is a Journal of Genocide Studies, which is an incredible development. We didn't have those things to talk about them. And finally, let's be honest about it, we, you and I, and everyone else in this audience are the luckiest people in the history of mankind, because we can communicate instantaneously. Our parents could not do that. And that's the advantage.
Thank you, Professor. We have a few questions, so with your permission, we will extend the discussion for another maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I now request Rohit to ask his question. Rohit?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is, how do you evaluate the role of Armenian diaspora in keeping up this issue alive in Western capitals, especially even after 100 years? So that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Rohit. This is an excellent question. Without the diaspora, obviously, this issue would no longer be in front of us. It is the diaspora that is keeping the genocide issue on the burner, if you would like, especially three important countries, the United States and Canada. Of course, they're separate countries, but in the United States and Canada, where you have a large Armenian population that is very active, in France, where there is a very prominent Armenian community, and including tremendously important singer Charles Aznavour, for example, a tremendously popular, who passed away 2 years ago, tremendously popular singer who used to say, I am 100% French and 100% Armenian. That's the kind of influence that he had in the French scene. And of course, in Lebanon, where there was, Lebanon and Syria, I should say, where there was a large Armenian diaspora, estimated roughly between 500 and 700,000 individuals. In these three countries, you had the diaspora that kept the genocide issue in front of the whole world community to see. Without the diaspora, the Republic of Armenia could do little because of the conditions that we talked about earlier. They were under the control of the Soviet Union. Russia wanted to decide for them, and they couldn't have the freedom. At one point, the patriarch of the Armenian Church, the Orthodox Armenian Church, could not even move about. He was a prisoner of Moscow, and he had to have permission to even deliver his religious duties to the population. It was tough to be in Armenia under the Soviet Union. 70 years of occupation. Of course, it's not the longest occupation on the planet. That's obviously the British have done that in Scotland, 800 years and counting. But it was a long occupation, so that the diaspora played a key role in my view.
Thank you, Professor. May I now request Meenakshi to ask her question? Meenakshi.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. And before I ask my question, I just wanted to say, sir, it's always a treat listening to it. It's always amazing. So I have two questions. One was partially answered, but I wanted to know what would be the status of Turkey inside NATO if Biden recognizes the genocide. And second one, so if we see the whole idea of genocide as the usage of the term, it came in the 1940s. But we see, considering the large number of Christians who were killed, Francis was the first who actually used the whole idea of genocide, which was even 100 years later than the incident, very recent, 2015-16. So what has been the reason that it took so long for the church to recognize it? Or what has been the reason why it actually did after exact 100 years? So I just wanted to know what has been the approach of the Holy See historically towards the genocide. Thank you.
These are extraordinarily profound questions, and I will try my best. We will see what happens between Turkey and NATO. I think that the meeting yesterday was the first time that Joe Biden spoke with President Erdogan of Turkey since he became president, almost 3 months. So there is a lot of hurt that needs to be worked out. And Turkey's position within NATO is up for grabs right now. The Turks have got to make a decision whether they want to stay with the West or they want to be against the West. That's a very key decision that they have to take. They claim that they can be friends with everybody. That doesn't work in the international arena. I think that those who believe that are not aware of how international politics works. But we will see. And the meeting at NATO, which is scheduled, I'm not sure, the first week or the second week of June of this year, will be very tense, since Erdogan and Biden, who have met before on several occasions, but for the first time, they will be face-to-face discussing very, very tough questions, especially now that that President Putin is playing such an important role in Turkish foreign policy. Time will tell. Now, your second question is far, far, far more important and very complex and very, very detailed. As you know, the Armenian nation is the first Christian nation on earth, 301, where as a state, as an empire, the monarch put the entire nation into Christianity. First Christian nation on earth, 301 AD. At that time, there was no such thing as Orthodox and Catholic, and none of these denominations existed. The split occurred in 451 at the famous gathering that took place. I will remember the name of the city in a second. Sometimes my mind is not as fast as my mouth. I have to think about it. I will remember it in a second. Chalcedon, thank you. I just remembered it. At the Treaty of Chalcedon, where the church had to make a decision, all these bishops got together at Chalcedon in 451 to decide on the nature of Jesus Christ, whether he was both man and God, or whether he was simply God. And the difference between the Orthodox and the Catholics is on the identity of Jesus Christ, essentially. Now, during the Holocaust, of course, and in Europe, Pope Pius XII has been accused of not recognizing the Jewish Holocaust. And the same can be said also about the Armenian genocide as well, where the Vatican has said little or nothing. But I remind you that Pope Francis visited Armenia in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and formally had a reconciliation. And there was a big church gathering at the Vatican itself, where the Orthodox leaders came, participated in the Mass at the Basilica in Rome. So there is some kind of a reconciliation going on. Is this enough to bring back Orthodox and Catholic churches together? I don't know. Religious questions tend to be a lot more political than religious. So time will tell whether or not they will put all their differences aside, since presumably they're both worshiping the same God and the same Jesus and everything else. So I think that this is really political more than anything else. And let's not forget that there is, in addition to the Orthodox Church in Echmiadzin outside of Yerevan, which is the world headquarters of the Armenian Orthodox Church, there is also two patriarchates, one in Istanbul and one in Jerusalem. So therefore, you're talking about a split of the Armenian Church. 90% of all Armenians are Orthodox. About 5% are maybe more, 5 to 6% are Catholic, and the rest are Protestants. So therefore, you're talking about a church that is somewhat unified, but we will have to wait and see whether politically they can be unified.
Thank you, Professor, for your reflection on these intricate and complex questions. Personally, and I'm sure even others would have enriched from your reflections. There are a couple of other questions. One is regarding the Sajid Inamdar has asked. He is unable to come on audio, so I'm asking on his behalf. He wanted to know how well integrated are the Armenian communities in Arab countries like Lebanon and Syria, and how is the memory of genocide preserved among these communities in Arab societies? The second question, let me ask, it's not related, but I wanted to club a couple of questions. Another question is from Dr. Samina Hamid. Again, she is unable to come online due to internet connections. He was asking about and I think during your presentation and in response to your some of the questions, you have already partly reflected on this question about how the issue is perceived within Turkey. And another point is whether we would eventually see Turkey, like Germany, kind of, the current Turkish generation or in future will kind of understand the need for recognizing as a matter to to issue an apology, as a matter for larger reconciliation of civilizations or cultures or nations. So your reflections on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will start with this last one because this is the key question as far as genocide is concerned. will there be recognition in Turkey? The fact that Joe Biden is going to recognize it today does not change much. Turkey must take this step. We're not there yet. The Turkish society is changing. There are approximately 2 million Turkish families today that have Armenian blood in them. Mostly some of the young girls that survived the genocide itself and that were taken in by various families. Obviously, these children grew up and they married and they're converted to Islam and they became Turks, Turkified Armenians, essentially. All of a sudden now there is a movement inside Turkey that is recognizing that that they have Armenian blood, whether they like it or not, because their grandmothers were Armenian. And the most famous individual that came out of this a couple of years ago was Fatih Kéchichian, who wrote a very interesting book called My Grandmother, which is available in English. And it's in several printing in Turkey already, whereby the grandmother acknowledged to her origins, and she discovered that she is partly Armenian as well. And there are thousands of these families now. Eventually, like in Germany, there will be in Turkey individuals who will come out and say, yes, our ancestors committed this crime, and it's time for us to acknowledge it and not hide behind all these semantics as to someone was pro-Russian, someone was working with the Russians, someone was having this. This is all semantics. The fact of the matter is that the genocide occurred by universal acknowledgement by the scientific community, and the Turks will eventually have to accept this. I remember years ago, the German chancellor at that time, Willy Brandt, went to Warsaw in Poland, and I think he went to Auschwitz, if I'm not mistaken, in front of the memorial, and he kneeled in front of the memorial. And now there will eventually have to be a Turkish Willy Brandt. But who is that Turkish Willy Brandt? I don't know. Someone who will come up and recognize these kinds of deeds. These things are historical facts. You cannot deny them. The recognition is a very important part. Of course, the Turks partly want to recognize for financial reasons, because once you recognize, you have to pay reparations. And you know, the Germans are still paying today to Israel reparations after all these years. They're still paying reparations. Obviously, the Turks will have to come to terms with the fact that they will have to be accountable as well, something which they don't want to do, because we're talking about billions of dollars here in the process. And some of these Armenian families in the rescue that were deported have their deeds, their home deeds, their family property deeds. All of these things exist. They haven't been destroyed. So the nation survived, so therefore accountability will come. Now, in the Arab world, this is a very important question. In the Arabs have opened their arms to the Armenian survivors. This is something very important. People don't appreciate it enough. I will not be speaking to you if it were not for the Arabs that welcomed my father, who was an orphan at the age of 2. I would not be here today if the Arabs had not welcomed my father. So therefore, like me, hundreds of thousands of people were welcomed in the Arab world. Those who made it to the Americas and Europe made it to the Americas and Europe, but a whole bunch of them also were taken in the Middle East as well, primarily in Iran, in Iraq, what are today Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and some in Jordan and in Egypt as well. So you have large communities. And of course, after the oil boom of the Gulf countries, you had from Syria, from Lebanon, from Iran and Iraq, Armenians that trekked to the Gulf countries. But as I have written in my own study on Saudi Arabia, King Abdul Aziz had 4 Armenian wives, and one of them was his favorite, Munira. She was an Armenian, and she gave him 3 of most talented sons, Talal, Nawaf, and Saddam, all of whom played important roles in the history of Saudi Arabia. So therefore, you have a very close relationship between Arabs and Armenians. And Lebanon, of course, is the first Arab country that recognized formally the Armenian Genocide. Far more important than that, within the constitution of Lebanon, there is actually a specific item whereby the Parliament of Lebanon has automatically Armenian deputies. There are 6 of them today out of 128. It is the only country in the world that actually has this clause within its constitution. So this doesn't exist elsewhere. In Syria, there is only one, even though the community there is much larger, or was much larger before the Syrian war started. So therefore, it's very important. In Iran as well, as Ambassador Singh was saying earlier, he saw with his own eyes what happened in Isfahan and elsewhere. And of course, in Tehran and elsewhere as well. So the relationship between the Arab world and the Armenian world is very, very close, very important. And people sometimes don't appreciate these kinds of human interactions, but they ought to, because that's how nations survive.
Thank you, Professor Kéchichian, for taking us through this issue, its historical relevance, its contemporary, significance, and various other, issues which you have reflected upon, various facets of it. I'm sure everyone in the audience has been enriched by your presentation today, and we hope that with this event and events of similar events, there would be more awareness on the issue, specifically on the Armenian genocide and genocide studies in general in India and around the world. Thank you again, and thank you to everyone in the audience for your very pertinent and provocative questions. May I now request Kumar Swami sir to take over and say the concluding words.